I want to thank you all for coming. I appreciate your time. I think what we'd like to do is start with some introductions. Andrea, would you go first?
Sure. My name's Andrea Jacobson. I'm retired from the Ketchikan Police Department after 21 and a half years, and for the last 5.5 years I've been working with the Alaska State Troopers.
Okay.
I'm Glen Klinkhart, retired Anchorage Police detective. I'm a writer, and I spent most of my career working homicides and missing people.
Dean?
Hi, I'm Dean Williams. I retired for 31 years and working mostly in juvenile justice, but also worked out of the DA's office for 5 years and did follow-up investigation on criminal cases, and spent a lot of time also doing internal investigations within certain state agencies.
Elisa?
My name is Elisa Hitchcock, and I have been working with Kimberly for a little over 20 years, writing murder mystery, dinner theater productions, and researching since 1999 the Sturgus murder.
I'm Kimberley Gray. Again, as Elisa said, I'm business partners with her for a number of years. My day job is event planning for the AGC of Alaska office. And this mystery has taken us beyond where we ever hoped it would go. So we're happy to have you guys here so we can talk about this, because there's questions we have that will never be answered, and we know that. As someone pointed out, we probably don't want to know what happened, because then the mystery will be over. Anyway, what I'd like to do is just kind of start asking you questions. One of the things that I think puzzles us is the timeline, and it's something that we've gotten out of the coroner's inquest. We'll probably never be able to fix our problems with the timeline, but just the whole where everyone was at 9:15 and how we could have that many witnesses to the crime that never saw each other, or just those type of issues. Andrea, do you want to speak to that?
Well, I just personally think, not really based on my experience, but just, I don't know, what time did you eat breakfast this morning?
Yeah, can't say.
Yeah, and I think that's a lot of people. They know a ballpark figure. So when you're talking, the movie got out about 9:15. By the time people mingle and walk down the street, it can be anywhere between 9:10 and 9:30. So I don't think the time frame is particular to the hour of 9:15. I think it could be just that general period of time. Nobody had a lot of watches. They had pocket watches back then. So I just don't think that people were correct when they're stating a time that I was there at 9:15. I think we're talking about a broad range. And the reason that I think it's possible for a lot of people to be in the same general area in the same time frame and hear or see different things is because they aren't expecting it. So when something draws their attention, they notice it. But by and large, they're not going out looking for a murder scene.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I agree with Andrea. Oftentimes when you work these cases, you can get caught up in the fact that people don't say the exact same thing. And that's because they're people, because they're not trained observers. They're not trained to immediately, once they see something, hone in on something. Looking at how somebody looks, where they go, those things. These things happen as a surprise, as she was saying. And so your ability to change gears all of a sudden is very difficult. What is important, though, in the timeline isn't the minute, but the segments, when things happen, the order in which they happen. And that's where going back from a behavioral standpoint is really important in that timeline, and what things are the same. So much, just because he or she said something different, look for the similarities. Look for where somebody who has no reason to lie says the same thing that somebody else says, or sees something. That's where I think you can at least hang your hat on that. You can't hang your hat on the things that don't match up.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Dean?
Yeah, as you know, I played Marshall Mossman in the production, and it bothered me too that as the story unfolded, you really don't have a very clean timeline. But I agree with my colleagues that the problem with that is that people's memory, as you're going through events, you don't remember things the same way, and that, of course, could be important, right? But it may not be, and so it's not just the timeline that really matters. It's what happens in that timeline and what information and what people are saying or what they're not saying. And for me, that was some of the more disturbing aspects of this story, is what was not said during the investigation.
That's really cool, because one of the things that we have been dwelling on is the timing of everything. Without being a police person, I just don't have that information of, oh, and by the way, if you pay attention to the details of the storyline, then you get it. But now, hearing what you're saying about time, I'm somewhat reassured. In a weird way, I suppose, because we're not solving anything with that. But it also takes it's not the main thing to be paying attention to now. It is Ma Baxter and McNutt going out and talking about 9/15, and yet they also do all these other things. They weren't paying attention at the time either.
Mm-hmm.
So when you say that, that helps. Now how would I use the timeline if that's all the information I have and I wanted to solve this crime? How would I use that timeline? As you were saying, look for the similarities to help me with my story, to find those odd aspects of the case that might puzzle me or that might make me want to ask more questions.
Well, I'll start with that. I think what you do is, if I was the lead detective on this case, the first thing that I do is I look for, what are the things that everybody's saying that are the same or similar, pretty close. Those are things that you can say, yeah, that's evidence. And line it up and map it out even, those timelines where people were. For example, you have your two witnesses, the women coming back. Mm-hmm. They had a pretty good view, but how far were they? One of the timeline things that I'm really interested in would be specifically McNutt's timeline. Mm-hmm. His order of business, when he saw, where he then went. How long does it take you to walk to try to find Chief Sturgus? And he goes to at least 2 places. And as far as the Crescent Hotel, where is the Crescent Hotel? How long does it take somebody in the middle of February at night to walk that far? There's some things there that you can figure out whether he's being truthful or honest based on his statement. If he's telling the truth, then you should be able to recreate that time. If he's not, then there may be some gaps there. And that's really what it comes down to, is looking at your witnesses, who are all witnesses to begin with, mm-hmm. and those that you can verify become good witnesses, and those you can't become suspects.
Now, off timeline is this aspect you brought up with McNutt. Mm-hmm. I find it strange that he didn't recognize Sturgis. They must have known each other for previously. He said, Sturgis has me go find him, and yet he didn't have a hat on. His hat was off to the side, so it's not like that covered his face. It wasn't buried in snow, so it just seemed unusual. So again, that would have been one of those things that I would have expected to see more questions on.
Well, I could be a devil's advocate here and say, what if he really is a drunk? It was sort of hinted at. Maybe if that's true, and if it's also true that he's had trouble in the past with drunks on his patrol and people passing out, what if he's just lazy? And what if he really didn't go over and try and wake up the guy and just said that, oh, there's another one, I'm not messing with him, and then he goes off to find somebody else to deal with something that he didn't think was his job.
So if they would have talked about that off court, then they would have said, well, we don't need to ask because we know we didn't bother. Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah. I think it could be that he's just a lazy guy and also didn't really want to get involved with anything because maybe he's got his own issues.
And he also said that his eyesight was not, and these are quotes and information, his eyesight was not as good as it used to be. So going with what Andrea is saying, he may well not have gone up or have gone slightly closer, but wouldn't have recognized him because he didn't see him well.
I like the idea. Andrea brings up a good point, and that playing devil's advocate with all of these is important. I see a lot of people who look at these cases, and they seem to play one side. You have to look at that. You also have to look at the idea that it was dark. What was the lighting like? Did he decide, it's another drunk, I don't want to deal with it? On the other hand, again, if he did go up, chances are very highly that he did recognize him. If he did, then why? Why did he all of a sudden have to leave the scene? And yet, if he was involved, there were people he could see saw him. Again, going back to that time reference, the shot versus, it didn't have to be 9:15, but the shot and then somebody came into the area very quickly. When somebody kills somebody, is this case something that somebody planned, or was it less of a planned event? That's going to affect your timeline and whether somebody said, uh-oh, things got bad, I got to get out of here, which is actually most murders.
So how important do you think it is that he left the house without his papers, his billy club, and possibly one of his guns, one's missing? I mean, how important to the case do you think that might be?
I think there are several things about that. This is what really bothers me about what facts do sort of line up together. I think you have to ask the first question, is it more likely or not that he knew the killer, the person that killed him, or a woman that killed him? And there are several things that tell me that he probably knew the person. And here's why. We're all theorizing, of course, on this. One is that after he was shot, he was very close-lipped about what happened to him. There's no report of him saying, I was shot, I don't know who it was. He was questioned. He was quiet. If something happens to you, normally you're the first one saying, this is what happened to me when you're the victim, right? If you have nothing to hide. You're telling, even if you don't know what happened, you have the chance to say what happened to you. We know that it was powder burns on his jacket. His jacket was open. He was acting, witnesses reporting him acting peculiar, strange, or before distracted, I think one of the witnesses said. And so there are several aspects of that, right? In one of them of themselves doesn't really mean much. But when you put that together, it starts to paint a picture for me of someone who's off their guard, who's not approaching a dangerous situation, or maybe not thinking that as much. He was shot with his own gun, too, as I think is one of the facts, too. That are not, all those little pieces of facts would lead me to say what's the motive of, it could be moonshiners or something, even though, as pointed out, he wasn't the person enforcing moonshine laws, right? And so those are the details that I would look closely at in terms of who had the motivation to kill him.
What do you guys think? The
Well,
paper's important?
Actually, if you remember when Anna said that he sometimes did go out without those. So I'm thinking that maybe this was one of those times. But he did take his guns, and he was supposedly always carrying his second gun. So I don't think that it was a matter of him just leaving his second gun at home, because it was never found. So I think that whoever did kill him not only managed to wrest his gun from him, but also was able to take his second gun and keep it. So I still think it's possible for him to know somebody and yet still have them not be a close friend or a person even in the community. He did enforce bootlegging along when he was a marshal. And if somebody served any time at all in jail, eventually they get out, and there's absolutely a very good chance that he would run into him in his new capacity when he recognized this person, possibly named Bobby. And there was that confrontation, seeing somebody that was rather angry at being arrested for moonshine and having his still smashed up like they used to back in those days. So it's still a possibility, but it was an up close and personal kind of thing. So.
I guess my question now would be, what would you guys have done different? How would you have handled this case if this was handed to you? I know it's hard to know all of what they had available in 1921 and who was your backup, but what do you think you might have done differently, or not that we know what they've done, but Andrea?
Well, I think the first thing I would do is consider the line of work he's in, and it's not like the drugstore guy was murdered. This is a guy that used to put people in jail. So I would look at recently released people that he had arrested, match up anything he could, they could, to find out who's in the town that may have a grudge against him. It's not the kind of, even back then, it wasn't the kind of job that you were the friendly officer who patrolled the streets. It was usually somebody who carried a billy club, somebody who routinely took care of the problems, even when he was a marshal. So I do think it's possible to go back into the records of the jail that were, I think at that time, were operated by the marshals, and see who has recently gotten out, and maybe somebody that particularly didn't like Sturgus.
Glenn?
I agree. I would also add, my personal favorite technique is about talking to people. As much as I love the CSI, I have yet to really have any cases except really one that the entire case revolved around some sort of piece of physical evidence. Usually those things tell you if somebody's lying or telling the truth, but you still have to talk to people. And one of the things that didn't happen back then was the separation and quick interviewing and interrogation of people like McNutt or the witnesses on the scene. These people, to get them locked into a story is what we call it. The idea is that you do it quickly so that they don't have time to talk. Clearly, even from the newspaper records, people were talking immediately. They were sharing stories. And so when somebody says, and they said multiple times, well, the talk is, so I guess that's what I saw. And there's a reason why you don't, that's the exact reason why you don't want that. You don't want that colluding. Even though it's not suspicious in and of itself, it's human nature. So getting people to give you a good detailed record as to what they remember, not maybe minute by minute, so that then when you are looking at all of those different things, is this the same? Is this different? If one of these things is different, that's the next lead.
I would say similarly, I haven't ever been responsible for homicide investigations like my friend here, but the reality is when I have looked at other things, you're trying to figure out what's going either internally in an agency or I worked in the DA's office. The most important thing of knowing what someone was going to tell you right out of the gate and what they were going to say in their most unguarded place, and making sure that you could really get that story down and then later compare it with facts that you may not even know what that's about, but really lock somebody into what their version of the facts are. And then out of that, you start to get a picture of who's more credible to you, who's less credible, and that can take you in different places that you didn't know when you first started that journey.
And that, in fact, is how much of these things had to be discovered, was communication. Because forensically, back then, in 1921, fingerprinting was just coming into its own in London. It wasn't even in America yet. We did some research to find out what forensically was available. There really wasn't much. And so communication and pulling people apart, they may not have thought of that, which would have been perfect. Because yes, like you say, the entire community knew what was going on within the first 12 hours of the whole event. And therefore, it does get colored.
And it is difficult when you're interviewing people, especially in a small town, when you know everybody and you know them on a first name basis, having those techniques to be able to get them to elicit the information as opposed to, well, I know you're a good guy. Yeah, that sounds good. We'll go on and go talk to somebody else. And being fair with being what we call a neutral, objective fact finder, that can be very difficult when you're dealing with people that you work closely with.
It was a very small community then.
Yeah.
How many people were there in Acreage?
2,000.
I was going to say
It
about
was very small.
2,500. Yeah.
Everybody
knew everybody.
Except for the 150 chichacos that were coming into town the day before. They were put up in other people's homes. They were not known. So that's a piece. But how do you communicate with them? How do you interview them if you don't know who they are?
Well, and one thing they talked about even in the paper, who's coming to the hotel, who's coming to which hotel, So that was kind of interesting. And sometimes they'd list everybody that was on the ships. All right, one of the things we noticed next is that the next police chief is a carpenter. What kind of obstacles must he have come into being a carpenter, and now he's thrust into this? Because one of his first duties was to, I don't think it was arrest, but deal with the people who carried guns in the streets. What kind of backup did he have? I mean, what kind of chance did he have to do a good job when he's been a carpenter for years?
Well, you're not going to find a lot of people with a lot of law enforcement experience out of 2,000 people. So I don't think that that's necessarily unusual. And back in those times when people hunted, people had to take care of their own problems, the proliferation of guns it's not surprising. And so I think we can see that even from today. But I don't know that it would be the kind of thing that would stop someone from doing a good job just because they didn't have a background in it. And certainly, his own motivation and other talents. Maybe he's a good people person. Maybe he was popular enough to know a lot of people and win the nod and also the support. So it's possible that he can do fine. I don't know why he was chosen though. I would like to know that.
I think he applied.
He applied. He applied before for the original when Sturgus was chosen, but Sturgus was chosen. I believe that maybe it was an attempt by the council, who selected him, to tone down the legal and the law force aspect of it, that particular position, because maybe they assumed that he was killed because he was doing too much work as a police officer. Maybe he did break down a steal too many and someone got out of jail and killed him. Maybe they assumed that with a carpenter they wouldn't have that issue. Or they could control him better. As you can tell, I'm maybe not a huge fan of the town council. I am suspicious of some of their personalities and aspects and connections, as you can hear in my voice and my thoughts.
Well, I think you have every right to be suspicious. I mean, anytime you're making law enforcement decisions on a political basis, that there's always room for suspiciousness there. Who knows who? Were there 3 or 4 people who originally applied for the chief of police?
I think there was a Lars Anderson.
Oh, okay, so maybe there were 3.
Okay, I thought there were at least more than 2, and then I was curious, if there's anything in the record indicating who, after the death of the chief, were willing to now put forward.
And I think this Lars and Kitzmüller was 2 of them.
Okay, so I do think that certainly one has to question, the reasoning behind it, whether it was also from the people. I mean, even today, when there's something bad happens, when you have a particularly public murder, people become very concerned. I mean, they start calling their city council. So things haven't changed, but I would imagine back then it was probably even worse.
Yeah, I
so
can imagine.
So I could easily see the decisions being made that weren't necessarily good for law enforcement, but were better to just make people happy, including those people that maybe worked on the shadowy side of the law.
And the council were not professional council people either. They were people from town. So they didn't know all the rules. They
Made them up as they go.
made them up as they went.
Dean?
I think it goes to the question of how hard do we really want to solve this murder? How invested were people in really trying to solve this murder? And under the best sky, that can be difficult, right? Even when everyone's uniquely interested in solving a mystery or a murder. But with all the questions you just talked about, that's another layer of why there certainly is a doubt about people after they were coming afterwards and why the murder was committed in the first place. The first chief of police, right? There should have been, you would thought there's been embracing, hey, we're for the city, here's the guy going to help keep order, and somebody has different thoughts. And even the way the whole investigation, we know that it was far from ideal. And that could have been bumbling. It could have been people incompetence and not knowing how to, do law enforcement, certainly. But it's certainly there's a number of factors there that it might have been more than that, and that's what makes this all the more murkier in many ways.
And being so far in the past.
Right.
Well, and I think the interesting thing to note is the 3rd police chief. Now, Kitzmüller was a couple of years on the job. And then the 3rd police chief was, I believe, law enforcement out of Cordova. And the council agreed to pay $50 extra a month. So they were paying $250, and they hired him. Now, the whole council wasn't approving of that because they thought that was a little too much extra money. But they did make that decision. Unfortunately, he was killed on the job about a month later.
Well, that just speaks to the town itself. It was
hard
pretty
time.
wild. They had a lot of kind of issues. And one of the things that makes me still lean in the direction of moonshiners is the fact that although Alaska law today doesn't even require motive as it's not an element of the crime, people want to know. People want to see that there's a connection of why this person killed another person. And so we always look for motive, even though it isn't a requirement that we look for it. And a lot of times I can't even see with McNutt that he had a motive. Most of the time when you think of a crime of passion, there's still an underlying event that caused an explosion that would cause that. But if these are just normal people that interact in a small town of 2,000 people, there would be a more obvious motive that someone would speculate about, and I didn't really hear that in the interviews. Nobody really threw out the fact that, well, he was having an affair, or, well, there's, these people in town that he's always had an issue with. And it just seemed to be absent from that conversation. So I'm leaning more towards the outsiders, the people that were transient. It mentioned there were a lot of transients. Even the people that coming through town. He was a police officer in another state. Who's to say one of those 150 people wasn't somebody he had a horrible case with in another state? And there's still the missing gun. And so I still think maybe somebody that came in from far away took the gun and left with it, and that's why nobody's been able to find anyone.
Well, and as soon as she said that, I solved the crime. Here's what happened. McNutt was actually robbing the drugstore. He came out the back. Sturgus caught him. They scuffled, he shot him, and he made up that silly story. I know we're running out of time, so I think the one question that everybody seems to ask at this juncture is, who do you think might have done this? With just the information we have available, because, boy, we could go on looking for additional information for months. Andrea?
Bobby the Moonshiner. Arrested by Sturgis on a previous occasion when he was a marshal. Ran into him after his release from jail.
Why not?
My prime suspect has to be McNutt. If it wasn't somebody else who hasn't shown up in that other list, he's got some explaining to do.
Dean?
I would go with McNutt, but there's still an unidentified person somewhere in my mind regarding the close proximity in which Sturgis was shot, the familiarity, the angle, which suggests that someone was, it's not, not known, but we know it's close proximity, and that the bullet went down. This all suggests something very up close and personal. And while McNutt is absolutely one person I'd want to have a very long, detailed interview with, he rises to the top. I never feel like there's a person hanging out there that we just don't know that's up close and personal with Sturgis that we just don't know about that did it.
My thoughts, and I alluded to it already, but the town council, and it may well have been an individual, but in some ways, I think that it may have been more than one because it didn't go any further. Yes, the investigation did happen in a roughshod way, or at least as far as we can tell, but I think the town council probably had something to do with it. Maybe one person had the shooting gun, but there were several people involved, in my eyes.
You know, I've always been suspicious of McNutt myself, just because of the whole I didn't recognize him thing, and you're right. There could be, it could be anyone. It could be somebody who came off the train.
Could have been his wife.
It could have been his wife. She wasn't the first wife. She was younger. About 6 months later, she remarries somebody else who suspiciously came into town the month before to open up the store. There could be tons of stories. And so every time you find out something new, that's me. I'm like, well, maybe I was wrong. Maybe it wasn't that person. But, McNutt to me is the most obvious. People who listen to the radio show, I think it's interesting because they tend to think Ma Baxter because of her timeline. That she's never anyone I've been thinking suspiciously of, but who knows? Who knows? Anything else you want to add? Is there a tidbit of information that you wish you had to keep going on with this case, or?
I think for me, the only thing that I try to tell other investigators and when I'm teaching these classes is to oftentimes the most difficult thing we have to do is taking ourselves out of our eyes. My born and raised in Anchorage, middle income, went to school here, and every time I'd go into a place in Anchorage that I had never been before, and oh my God, people live like this, or this is the rules of their house, or this is how they handle. Imagine, if you will, we have to stop and put ourselves in 1921. That's tough enough. To be able to do that when women didn't have certain rights, when people were treated differently, when attitudes of what was right and wrong would completely be out of place here. It makes it even more difficult when you're talking about motivations. Things that people would allow back then are things that you'd be like, yeah, you would go to jail for the rest of your life for those things. So changing that, your own eyes of what culture looks like, to me is the most difficult thing for me to try and do.
No, the only most disturbing point of the whole thing is why the victim, the main person who had an interest in the outcome, which was not good for him, was Sturgis, and why he wasn't hollering his head off and telling everybody what happened, where he was at, what was going on. He's still speaking. He's on the table. He's complaining about the light, and I have a headache, and whatever is going on. And there's no record of him saying, this is what happened to me. He was quiet even despite being asked about it. And that is a huge red flag for me.
Yeah, he was not hit on the back of the head and unconscious and then turned around, flipped over and shot. So he did see this killer. We just will never find out from him who that was because he wouldn't say anything.
Because if you guys are right and you look for the similarities, only one person said that he said, oh, Bobby, Bobby. And so is that something he made up to throw us, there's a number of reasons. You could
And
have
it's
said
still
that.
difficult when a body is dying. It's going through those death throes. It's very difficult. Your body is doing everything it can to preserve life, not give you good information. And he had been there for a while. He was in a lot of agony and a lot of pain based on the entry between the ribs coming into the back, which may actually explain why you want to be rolled over, because his pain, even though you think it hurts to have a bullet hole here,
But
lodged back here may have actually been worse. So he wanted that pressure off. There's a lot of things that go on there with that body that, you know, I think I only had one case where somebody was actually, after being shot, able to really talk in a way that you could understand them. But at the same time, boy, it would have been nice if he had given us something a little bit clearer.
And he was also on the ground for a long period of time, because his hair was frozen to the ground.
It was cold.
Well,
It was
again,
cold.
it goes back to that timeline. How long did somebody take to get to him at the same time? Temperature? Right? One of the first things we teach is to go get, you know, what was the outside temperature, what were the lights.
-8.
A negative. That's pretty darn
And
cold.
the moon
Yeah.
was a quarter moon or less, I believe.
No, I think it was almost full.
Was
In
it?
2 days, it was a full.
That's right.
Wow.
That's right. I got that
Yeah,
backwards.
so all those little
So,
things can make a big
light-wise-
difference when it comes to the heat of a body, how long you've been there. You know, a head it tends to be very, very warm, but then again, hair, as it, you know, something cools and there's any movement, that tends to freeze and clump. You know, yeah, there's a lot of things there, but you're asking the right questions.
Cool. Thank you for coming. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.